Welcome everyone to our first summer something. This is the ASA Brown Bank Lunch Talks, and this is our chance to hear from women and men of faith who are navigating their careers in the natural and social sciences as God has called them and gifted them. So today we're reaching into the archives from 2016, the annual meeting at Azusa Pacific University, to reprise one of our audience favorites as a talk. And more than just hearing from that talk, though, we have the opportunity today to have in person with us Dr. Audrey Bowden. Welcome, Audrey. Let me give you some ground rules. These are kind of like your baseball park rules, right? Things you want to do and not do. First of all, please stay muted throughout the day today. We're going to try that as our route. And the other thing is that you can ask questions through the chat function. And if you enter those questions during the talk and at the end, I will monitor that chat and bring those questions up. So just be sure that you can have those, we could have some interaction going on. I hope you've all got a cool one along with you. This is summer something, and so you need a little something to refresh yourself along the way, and we should have a good time. If you've not ever met Audrey, or you're in for a treat today. She's not only a gifted researcher, but she's a passionate advocate for what we here at ASA have called science and technology in the service to the poor. Audrey, as you will hear, has learned to be an effective witness throughout her academic career in secular settings. And the Lord has blessed her as she's grown in that way. And right after hearing her talk, she'll come back in, as I said, for the Q&A, and so you can enter those questions. When we first met her 4 years ago, Audrey was at Stanford University. As the talk begins, we'll hear some details of her academic accomplishments, so I won't give you those right now. But since that time, she and her now young family have moved from Stanford out in the Bay Area and San Francisco area to Nashville. And she's set up a new Bowden lab at Vanderbilt University, where she's Associate Professor of Biomedical Engineering and also Electrical Engineering. Audrey was recently named the Dorothy J. Wingfield Phillips Chancellor's Faculty Fellow. And you might wonder, what is that? Well, that's for mid-career leaders in STEM and diversity at Vanderbilt University. And it's quite an honor. And she's also just been named the inaugural faculty head of the Nicholas Zepos College. That's a residential college for sophomores and juniors and seniors that's opening this August. So as you can see, Audrey's been very, very privileged, very busy along the way. So we're privileged today to have Dr. Bowden with us. And now let's listen to the 2016 talk, Imagining a Bright Future for Healthcare.
Good morning. We are so pleased to have Audrey Bowden come speak to us today. She is an assistant professor of electrical engineering at Stanford University. She holds a bachelor's of science in engineering and electrical engineering from Princeton University, a PhD in the biomedical engineering from Duke University, and completed postdoctoral training in chemistry and chemical biology at Harvard University. She also spent a short time as an international fellow in Singapore and as a legislative assistant in the United States Senate through the American Association for the Advancement of Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program sponsored by the OSA and SPIE. Bowden directs the Stanford Biomedical Optics Group, whose mission is to develop and deploy novel tools for optical imaging at the microscale and nanoscale. The group also has a particular interest in the development of low-cost, portable technologies suited for use in poorly resourced environments. Welcome, Audrey.
So the title of my talk today is Imaging or Imagining a Bright Future for Healthcare. And so that connects with my background and my interest. So the work that I do is in medical imaging. And what I wanted to say, as I mentioned, was that I was praying about what to speak about and how to share what I do, but also aspects of my faith journey and my continuing faith walk as I go through this work. And so what I wanted to do was start a little bit with my background and how I got to where I am. And I hope, especially for the students in this room, you've heard a little bit of my biography. It's a little bit circuitous and unusual, so hopefully that will be inspiring and comforting to some of you. So I'll start with high school. So I went to a science and math magnet high school, and it was a great place to grow up and develop. Very early on, I got involved in research as a high school student, but I also had a lot of different interests. So I was an athlete, a three-sport athlete actually in high school, and I also loved languages and French, and so I loved kind of thinking about traveling and studying abroad, though I didn't get a chance to do that in high school particularly. In high school, as I mentioned, I studied science and math. It was a magnet school for that, and so I didn't really know what engineering was, but everyone said, oh, you like science and math, you should be an engineer. And I said, okay, that sounds interesting. So I applied to college for engineering, and I decided to go to Princeton, which was relatively close to home. I'm from New Jersey. And at Princeton, I ultimately decided to study electrical engineering. It was mostly a process of elimination. I knew what I didn't like. It was really hard for me to necessarily say I fell in love with this, but kind of by process of elimination, I ended up studying electrical engineering, and I did enjoy it. And at some point in my career, I had to make a choice about how to delve into a particular area of electrical engineering. And one of the things that fascinated me a lot was the study of light. And so I studied optics as an undergraduate. I also was an athlete in college, so I started out rowing on the crew team because I thought that it would give me big muscles. And after about a year, when I learned that people can break their ribs rowing, I decided to try a safer sport, and I played rugby for the next 3 years, much to the chagrin of my parents. And as you can see, I went to a liberal arts school, so I took a diversity of classes while I was in college. And afterwards, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had always had this interest in languages, as I mentioned, but I didn't get a chance to really pursue that as a student. So I wanted an abroad experience. And so I applied for a program to teach abroad, which ultimately took me to Singapore. And so while I was in Singapore, I was teaching math and computer science, and I also had a chance to travel a lot, so it worked out very, very well. And Singapore was actually quite a formative time for my faith as well, because the church that I attended was a relatively young church. It was quite large, but the majority of the people in that church were under 25. And it was an amazing experience because the majority of those people actually came from families where they didn't have Christians as parents, and I had grown up in a Christian home. And so it was quite amazing just being around other young adults who were so passionate for Christ and whose faith was so clearly their own. It wasn't something that they had just grown up with. They decided, they were constantly fighting with their families about being Christians. And so that really inspired and helped grow me. Well, after Singapore, I went to graduate school. And I went to Duke. And while I was at Duke, I studied biomedical optics. So in high school, I had actually become interested in healthcare and bioengineering, but I knew I didn't want to be a doctor, and I knew I wanted to do something else. So grad school was where I had a chance to merge those two things together. So I studied biomedical optics. So I was working on optics, but for the purposes of medical applications. And the pictures that you can see up here just represent other aspects of my life. So to be perfectly honest, I had found college quite difficult. And so I thought when I got to graduate school, I needed to relax a little bit and try a bunch of different things. And so I wasn't your typical graduate student, always in the lab. Sorry, maybe some of you should close your ears about this, but, so I did a lot of other things. I was president of student council. I went to basketball games. I was on a salsa team with undergrads, which was really weird because they like to practice at 10 p.m. at night. And as you guys saw, I go to bed at 9:30. But it was a great time. And oftentimes I say that graduate school was the best days and the worst days of my life. Because it was the best days. I really enjoyed it. But in graduate school is just hard. All of you know that, right? There are days when you just face failure after failure. And you question yourself and who you are and all these things. Well, I wasn't sure in going to graduate school that I actually wanted to follow an academic career path. So I spent a lot of time searching and looking for other things to do. And one of those things that I stumbled upon was public policy. And I had one of those moments where I learned about public policy, and I thought, wow, that sounds really great and really interesting. Maybe I should go do that after graduate school. And so I did. I joined a program called the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellows Program, which took me to Washington for the year, and I worked in the Senate. And so I was a legislative assistant, got to see and work on national policy right around the time when the economy was pretty much tanking. So it was a really interesting time to be in Washington. There was a lot of focus on the housing market and what was changing and new policies. And so, I really enjoyed it. But for reasons that I'll share later on, I knew that God was actually calling me to a different path. So I went to Washington knowing that I would only be there for 1 year. During that year as well, I got a chance to do some short-term mission work and really connected with the idea of providing and servicing the poor and people who don't have infrastructure. And that partly influenced my decision later to do a postdoc after this fellowship at Harvard, where I worked for a professor who had a pretty big research effort on global healthcare technologies. And so he had a company called Diagnostics for All, where essentially one of the taglines was simple solutions and zero-cost diagnostics. So we were working on things that were really intended to help and assist places that didn't have access to resources, that didn't have consistent electricity. I had a chance to travel to Haiti and help deploy some of these devices. So it was a really wonderful opportunity. And then after that, I started at Stanford. So I've been at Stanford for several years now. As you've heard, I'm an assistant professor. I have my own lab working on biomedical optics. And so our focus is on optical tools for imaging and sensing. And we do a little bit of work in low-cost portable technologies that's kind of growing right now. Now, all of that sounds like a pretty smooth story, even though it kind of has some twists and turns in it. But that's not really how it worked. The path of my call, like many of us, I think, was one of following open doors, listening to encouraging words, and taking leaps of faith. I think the fact of the matter is that for a lot of my life, I felt inadequate and unprepared for the next step that God was calling me to, and each one of these was a new step. So I mentioned in high school, I was in a science and math high school, and I was told to go into engineering, but I actually went into engineering not really knowing what it was. I decided to pursue that path, even though I had no clear understanding of what that would look like. I decided to go to Princeton, actually, even though I had originally told myself I didn't want to go to Princeton because it was too close to home. And an unusual thing about my high school was I was in the second graduating class at my school. They actually had no one who'd gone to Princeton yet. It was a New Jersey school, so they felt they had to have someone who went to Princeton. And so I felt this burden, and I decided to go. But, the amazing thing was God met me there. And as soon as I got to campus, I remember the first day I walked into my dorm, and underneath my door, there was a flyer that said, "Are you looking for God on campus?" And I said, "Yes," and he was there. Now, the next step from Princeton to graduate school, actually, the reason I went to graduate school was because my dad told me that I had to. He took me for a walk one day and said, "You have to go to graduate school and get at least a master's, and I'm not going to pay for it." Okay. And so I said, okay, I have to go to graduate school, and I applied for master's programs everywhere. I thought, wow, it would be cool to be a doctor someday, but I really had very little confidence that I would get into a PhD program. And so the interesting thing is I didn't apply for PhD programs anywhere, and everywhere I applied, I got into a PhD program. So I was accepted to Duke, among other places. And the interesting thing about my story at Duke was I went to Duke, during my kind of visit and interview at Duke, I had a very influential interview with the dean of the school at the time, which was a bit unusual for a student to be interviewed by the dean during their visit. God set up so many unusual things. And this person happened to have gone to Stanford. She was a Stanford alum. And during one of my conversations with her, I left her office just feeling like, wow, like this, I want to emulate this woman. She's so wonderful. And I had really actually wanted to go to Stanford for graduate school. I had applied and I'd gotten in. But I left that meeting thinking, well, if God really wants me at Stanford, then somehow he'll bring me back there. And I decided to go to Duke, closed the door, and I never thought about it again. as I mentioned, when I was in graduate school, I had not really intended to pursue an academic career, and so I was planning to do all these other things. And it was that dean, who happened to be a Stanford alum, who happened to sit on the committee of the advisory board of the electrical engineering department at Stanford, who happened to tell them about me when they were looking for a faculty candidate. And they contacted me and said, "Hey, we heard you might be interested in applying for this job." And I said, "No." "Where did you hear that from?" And I remembered in that moment that I had heard that voice 5, 6, 7 years before, that if God really wants me at Stanford, that somehow he'll bring me back there. And that was the only reason that I decided to apply. And so I applied to Stanford, and I got the job, surprisingly, to me anyway. And I knew once I got it, I had to go. That was an open door that God had provided for me, and he intended for me to be there. And so I put that before my trip to Harvard, because I actually knew I was going to Stanford before I ended up doing my postdoc at Harvard, which itself was another God moment of planting and planning for me to be there. So anyway, that's a little bit about my call. And so I really feel like my work at Stanford has been a call to ministry, that God called me there. And the only reason I'm there, the only reason I went there, is because I feel like God had put it on my heart, had opened the doors for me to be there. So some of you might have that experience or might not have had that experience, but just to encourage all of you, just as you walk through open doors, that God will meet you there. Okay, so a little bit about the work that I do. Let me first make a case for imaging work. And I'll take a few verses from the Bible. So Matthew 6, verse 22 to 23. "The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is within you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" The Bible, as we heard, contains so many different metaphors for light and sight and vision and seeing, and I think it's so wonderful. And for me, it's really makes part of my work a spiritual experience every day, that I get to work with this technology that I think is so close to what the biblical text talks about. And so what I think about this passage is that it's really telling us it's important to see. It's important to basically create images and be able to see what's inside. And a case for light, well, light is at the very heart of who God is and what he is, right? He tells us, "This is the message we have heard from him and declare to you, that God is light, and in him there is no darkness at all." So why do we use light for medical imaging? Well, light has a lot of different properties that are actually quite valuable for medical imaging. Well, first of all, if you're going to image the body or do something in healthcare, you don't want to kill people. So the optical photons that we work with, at least in the regimes that I work with, are generally non-ionizing, which means that they're not harmful. I don't do X-ray work or DPV or anything like that. So these light waves basically just go through the body, and they're not harmful in using the doses that we use, which is good. One of the technologies that I work with primarily is something called optical coherence tomography, or OCT. So OCT is an imaging technique similar to other medical imaging techniques that you might have heard of, like X-ray imaging, MRI, ultrasound, PET scans, etc. So what distinguishes OCT from these other techniques has to do with various properties, like its resolution. So it can see details that are around 10 microns or so, which is pretty small. We can get really high time resolution images, so we can see things really fast. We can create almost three-dimensional volumes or see things in pretty much real time. We can image about 1 centimeter into the body, so we can't see through the whole body, but we can see kind of shallow depths, and depending on how we design our probes, for example, we can make them minimally invasive. So we can design an OCT probe to fit inside of an endoscope that the doctor might feed inside of your body. So even though we can see only 1 centimeter in, we can see it from the inside, or we can look it in from the outside. So this graph on your right, on my right, on my left, your right, basically shows the difference in spatial resolution of different technologies versus how deeply into the body the technology can penetrate. So OCT fits kind of right in the middle. So I can't see as deeply as MRI and ultrasound, but we can get good high-level details. So oftentimes people like to say that with OCT or with MRI and ultrasound, we're kind of imaging the body on the scale of the human body. So the types of features that we can see are human-sized features, whereas with OCT, we can see comparable features, but in a much, much smaller animal model, like the mouse. So OCT basically takes light, and we're trying to use that light to see what's happening inside of the body. The body, it turns out, is a reflector. Isn't that amazing that we were designed to reflect light? So what we do is we send light in. Yeah, I think you can see it. So there's a light wave that comes inside of the body, and the body is actually a multi-layered reflector. So it's kind of like a series of partially reflective mirrors. So as that light comes in, it interacts with the body, and at various layers, a portion of that light reflects back. And so what we do is we measure when that light reflects back and how much light reflects back from each layer. And based on that, we can figure out where the layers are and something about their composition or the differences between those two layers. So, in general, OCT works by using this source of backscattering signal. The measurement that we make is essentially a time of flight measurement, as I mentioned, but we don't measure the time of flight directly. Light travels a little too fast for that, so we use indirect methods called interferometry. And the types of light sources that we typically use for OCT are in the infrared regime, so roughly 800, 1300 nanometers. So for those of you who aren't calibrated to that, visible wavelengths are roughly 400 to 700 nanometers, so infrared wavelengths are slightly longer than that. Another key aspect of the light sources that we use, we don't use classic lasers. We use lasers that have what's called a broad bandwidth. So they emit a lot of different wavelengths at the same time. And it's this broad bandwidth or spectrum of light that allows us to actually section inside of the body and to see the different layers. So the picture that you see on the right is an example of an image that you might see with OCT. So light comes in, and what you're seeing is a cross-sectional image. So for example, if I were to image your hand under OCT, we wouldn't see the palm of your hand. We'd actually see a slice through your hand and the different layers of skin and other fat and other materials that are inside. So light comes in, as I mentioned, it reflects back at different layers inside of the body. We measure how much light reflects back and also the timing of that, and that we generate what we call an A scan, which is just a line telling us where the light reflects and how much. And then we do that over and over and over again for different parts of the body. And we generate a full two-dimensional image. So we get what's called a B scan. So ultimately, the types of images that we can get are 3 dimensions. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side on the top is an OCT image of a finger. So this will work. So you can see these kind of undulations that I'm trying to point out here. Those would be the ridges and valleys of your fingerprint. But what's important is we're not just seeing the surface of your finger, we're actually able to see what's inside. So the subsurface of your finger. So the epidermis, dermis layer. In fact, these curlicule structures right here are sweat ducts. So if you were looking at this, a live image, you should be able to see sweat evaporating from inside of your body. And on the right-hand side, you're seeing a picture of an eye captured with OCT. So this looks like any image that you might capture with a camera, but remember that we can slice this image in any direction. So at the bottom, you're seeing a slice across this eye, taken something like this. So you can see the front surface of the eye or the cornea. Here's the lens that we were talking about earlier today in the human eye. The retina, which is at the very, very back visual processing center of the eye, would be somewhere closer to the bottom. So OCT as a technology has actually been deployed in many different areas, including in ophthalmic clinics. I don't know if any of you have ever had an OCT scan of your eye before. Anyone? 1 or 2 people. Yeah. So it's actually now become, it's a pretty young technology, but the researchers have pushed it so hard that it's actually been clinically accepted as a gold standard imaging technique for looking at the back of the eye non-invasively, to look at, in particular, retinal pathologies. It's also being used in cardiology and a number of different areas for all the reasons that are listed on the right-hand side. A few other applications of OCT besides ophthalmology, cardiology include developmental biology. So again, it's non-invasive, so we can easily do longitudinal studies over small animals. It's being explored as an alternative to x-rays in dentistry, even in pharmacology, art conservation for being able to see below the surface of a picture without actually destroying the picture, and other things like that. So to get into a little bit of one of the problems that I work on, Birefringence is a property of materials that basically takes light of a certain orientation and can change that orientation. And so what we want to measure is this change in orientation of light. The orientation of light is something that we call polarization. And there are a lot of different materials in your body that exhibit birefringence, particularly your muscles commonly exhibit birefringence, but also your skin. And birefringence actually can tell you something about how orderly the structure is of a particular material. So if the muscles are nicely oriented and aligned, then they're going to show one signal. If they start to be disarrayed and disordered, they're going to show another signal. And so that's what we're actually looking for in our studies of skin. And what we're studying is skin cancer. So skin cancer is a it's a prevalent, but it is a treatable disease if it's caught early enough. So there are over 3.5 million new cases in the US. And the way that it's often detected is usually by visual inspection. So you go to a primary care physician, they see something that they think looks suspicious. And if they think it's too suspicious, they'll take you to the doctor, the dermatologist, and they'll do a biopsy to actually remove some of it. Now, this is okay if it's occurring in some part of your body that's not visible, but a lot of the skin cancers actually feature in prominent places like the face and neck, places that you really don't want to have a lot of biopsies. And so this wouldn't be an ideal technology. What we're looking at in particular are basal cell carcinomas. So basal cell carcinomas, or BCC cancers, are the most commonly occurring form of skin cancer, so roughly comprise about 80% of all skin cancers. And they can be quite disfiguring and discomforting. So this is just showing you a picture of the skin. We can see the different layers, the epidermis, dermis, and some fatty tissue below. And the basal cells are located at the boundary, essentially, between the epidermis and the dermis. So basal cell carcinoma is essentially a form of cancer that originates in the basal cell. There are other types of cancers that originate by other cells in the skin. So in terms of the clinical needs, what we'd really like to do is provide the primary care physician with tools that they can use before it has to go to the dermatologist to detect the cancer non-invasively, be highly sensitive, because the primary care physicians aren't as trained to detect and know what is cancer as a dermatologist. But how many people have tried to get an appointment with a dermatologist before? They're not always accessible when you think they should be. So we really would like to provide some tools that might work in the primary care suite. So we want this diagnostic to be highly sensitive and, of course, automated, because one of the barriers to introducing new technologies in the hospital is training the physicians and getting them used to and oriented to something that they've never worked with or never seen before, and has to work better than whatever they've been using currently. Ultimately, we, of course, love this to be low cost, but that's not something that we're working on right now. So we're looking at basal cell carcinoma, and our goal is to detect the basal cell carcinoma at the earliest stages, so to do early cancer diagnostics. And so, as I mentioned, the basal cells are in the subsurface of the skin, so they originate at the epidermis-dermis boundary. Well, OCT can actually detect things below the surface of the skin, so it sounds like a perfect match. So this is a picture of normal mouse skin, and the image that you're seeing on the left is a histology image, which is essentially a slide that they've made of tissue. And so you can see some of the features of the skin that the doctor would normally use and look at to detect cancer. This is an OCT image of a similar piece of normal skin. And so we can capture these cross-sectional images, what are called B scans, using OCT, and we can differentiate them from scans that have cancer. So you can see on the bottom where we have a tumor. This tumor shows prominently here. And then it shows as an area of intensity contrast in the OCT image as well. So OCT has a decent resolution to be able to detect these types of things, good imaging depth. However, what we found is that when people were using traditional OCT, they were only able to achieve sensitivities below 90%, sensitivities and specificities. And these are two metrics that doctors often use to determine how well is the technology performing. And they want something that's better than 90% most of the time. So what we found is that by adding information about the orientation of the various collagen fibers that are in the skin, which is detectable using birefringence, we can actually improve this sensitivity and specificity. So we did an initial test of this in mouse. And so what you're seeing here is the polarization contrast image from the OCT. The colors basically tell you something about the birefringence properties. And again, you can see in the tumor image, we have areas of low birefringence. And so what we were interested in is figuring out to what degree this change in birefringence gives us additional contrast that we can use to better identify which images are going to be healthy versus which images are going to be cancer. So we want to do this ultimately in an automated way. So our goal was to extend our work from BCCs in mouse to human skin, develop automated techniques that could be used by the doctors, and make sure that it's non-invasive and highly sensitive. Ultimately, we hope that we can eliminate the need for biopsy altogether so that people who don't actually have skin cancer don't have to have biopsies. So just a quick overview of some of the methods that we use. In our lab, we developed a system to do the imaging, and then we're going to use some advanced computer vision techniques to build a classifier, which is going to allow us to automatically detect whether there's cancer or not cancer in an image. And then, of course, we're going to test our classifier. So the main procedure that we go through is we capture these unused pieces from Mohs surgery, which is one of the most common surgeries used to treat skin cancer. So we get them from human tissues. We take these samples. This was an ex vivo study. We take these samples, we image them with polarization sensitive OCT. We capture a number of different images. So we capture images from healthy patients. We capture images from patients who have BCC. So we capture a total large number of images. For those of you who are interested, the system that we use looks something like this. So it's an interferometer. See if I can walk you through, those of you who might be interested. So here's the light source. Gets split into a reference arm and a sample arm. This is a Mach-Zehnder interferometer configuration. Here's our detector, which is a polarization-sensitive, polarization balancing detector. So we have two detectors to detect the horizontal and vertical channels of the polarized light. And we're using single input polarization state system, single mode fiber, which is intended to make the system more portable. So these are the types of images that we get. So on the top left, you can see an example of the histology, and then the OCT images for intensity, and then the phase retardation or the birefringence contrast, which is a little bit more colorful. And you can see the contrast with BCC. Again, here we have this tumor. The tumor shows up here, but as you can see, the difference between the tumor and the normal skin is not that apparent when we're looking at the images in standard OCT. And that contrast increases when we look at the phase retardation image because, well, the colors go away. The colors basically tell us there's no birefringence, which means that everything has gotten scrambled. One of the challenges that we had with this set of samples is that there are actually many different subtypes of BCC, and so there's a large diversity in the types of images that we can capture. And so this is another type of BCC where you can see we have kind of two islands of tumors, and in the phase contrast image, phase retardation image, we actually don't have this single large mass of loss of birefringence. It actually appears in a more island form, and there's actually some colors here that might be suggestive of healthy. So on our own, we actually can't use our human discrimination to be able to figure this out easily, which is one of the reasons why we turn to the use of machine learning. So we build this classifier by capturing the images, extracting features from these images, then selecting features that are going to improve the accuracy, and we select a diversity of features. So the types of features that we get include what are called A-scan-based features and B-scan-based features, and I won't kind of belabor the point, I'll just kind of switch through. The idea of A-scan features is that we're looking at features that correspond to just a single line through the image, whereas with B-scan features, we look at features that correspond to some average or some information that's extracted from the whole image altogether. And then at the end of the day, the results that we get are really what matters. So we take all of these features that we have, we want to select the best classifier that we can. So originally we selected a classifier that has a lot of features from the images, so a total of 1,300 features, which is way too many features for a reasonable classifier. But then we go through several optimization rounds, and through this process we ultimately end up with a smaller subset of features, which will allow us to actually run this classifier on the data in a much quicker time period. So then we choose which classifier we want. So there are a lot of different classifier options that we tested and went through. Ultimately, we ended up with a support vector machine with a Gaussian kernel. Again, that's kind of a detail for those of you who are interested. But at the end of the day, what's important is then we have this classifier whose goal is to take an image that it's never seen before and be able to predict, is this healthy or is this a cancerous image? And so using the intensity features only, we can get something that has accuracy that's similar to what others had gotten. So 70%, between 70 and 90%. When we do the phase retardation features, we actually can get something that's closer to 90%, which is what we're aiming for. And when we combine both feature sets, we can actually finally get something that's greater than 95%. So we have a classifier now that has a specificity and sensitivity of 95%. Which is really, really promising. And another way of characterizing this data is by looking at what we call the receiving operator characteristic. So it's a curve that maps the sensitivity and something related to the specificity on one axis, and you draw a line telling you something about the performance of your classifier. And basically, you want this line to be drawn such that the area under the curve is as large as possible. So the metric that we're looking for is to maximize the area under the curve. And so what we found was that when we use intensity features only, we get an area less than 80%. With the phase retardation features, we get something close to 95%. And when we add both together, we get something close to 97%. So what this tells us is that we definitely have a method that is working towards being able to very accurately predict, from these images whether or not we have cancer or healthy images, which is going to be useful for the primary care clinic. The study that we've done so far in this work has been ex vivo, and so our next step is to basically start testing this in the hospital. So we're setting up the protocols now, working with our clinicians to be able to take our new probe, which we've designed that will allow us to do this in a handheld fashion, to go into the clinic and possibly determine, non-invasively if there's cancer or not in the images. Okay, so I'll just mention one other project that we have on cancer, just to round out this talk. So another project that we've been working on a lot has been thinking about visualizing and staging bladder cancer. So we've been working with a urologist, and this project actually has several components to it, unlike the previous one. So there's a hardware component where we need to develop new hardware technologies that allow us to get inside of the body and see cancer in its earliest form at the earliest stages. And then also we need software that allows us to better visualize and better register all this data together. So the challenge that we undertook, first of all, was designing a probe. We were going to use OCT for reasons that I won't enumerate right now, but designing a probe that could actually fit inside of the working channel of a cystoscope, which is an endoscope that goes inside of the bladder. Now the challenge there is that the flexible cystoscope has a really, really small working distance. It's really, really small working channel, and so we needed to develop a probe that was smaller than what others had developed before. So that's part of the innovation that my lab does in engineering, is to develop these very, very small probes. So we develop, these very small, fast, forward-viewing probes that allow us to now go inside the bladder and look around. And I guess I didn't explain a little bit about why bladder cancer is important and what's kind of motivating us there. Well, one of the things that motivates us to think about bladder cancer is, it's the 5th most common form of cancer in general, probably 4th or 5th in men in the US. And one of the interesting facts I think about bladder cancer is actually its recurrence rate is very, very high, somewhere between 50 and 90%. So once you have bladder cancer, you are need to undergo monitoring for the rest of your life, because the chances of you getting another incidence of bladder cancer are extremely high. As a consequence, you undergo this kind of diagnostic every 6 months to 1 year for the rest of your life. And because a portion of this is they're unable currently to avoid having you go into the operating room where you have to undergo anesthesia, it's very costly. So bladder cancer actually is the most costly form of cancer over a patient's lifetime of any cancer. So if we can do something to help with this earlier diagnostic, helping them to identify things that can prevent them from having to take the patients into the OR, we're going to reduce the cost of healthcare, and then hopefully also help reduce recurrence, because a lot of recurrence has to do with them not being able to identify the earliest stages of cancer. So we're working on that. We're developing probes that allow them to go inside and now see below the surface, which is where the cancer starts, so they can start to see the cancer before it actually makes it to the surface, which is where the tools that they currently have are limited to seeing. We've been doing some work as well to be able to take these very, very small probes that we have, which the disadvantage is that we have a small viewing area, but the bladder is relatively large. So we have to develop new algorithms that allow us to take these small viewing areas and stitch them over large areas so that we can get a more panoramic type view inside. So this is just an example image showing that we were able to develop a stitching algorithm to use a freehand probe and stitch together something that looks reasonable. And then the other thing that we've been thinking about is exploiting the data that's already collected during the cancer surveillance procedure and converting it into a format that allows the doctor to have a more convenient form of reviewing it. So right now they collect all these videos, but they throw the videos away. They maybe keep a few images, write a few notes. But this is the video age, right? There's so much that we can be doing with video. So one of the things that we've been working on is taking these videos and using new computer vision algorithms to generate 3D models that allow them to go back, review the videos, and actually kind of redo a virtual surgery without having to go back into the patient. This will allow them to now compare surgeries over time and start to track in an easier way what's happening with the cancer. But I want to just take a few moments before I close to talk about a little bit where my faith comes in as I work on this work. So there are 3 elements of my faith that I really want to share with you that have been really important as I walk this journey of being a professor. I think oftentimes as scientists, we really value knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge. And I think that for a lot of us, our work really leads us to wonder. I remember when I was a postdoc, I would walk across campus and I would just think, wow, my work is worship. Like just being able to study these things and to see and reveal the structures that God has made. The Bible says it is the glory of God to hide matter and the glory of kings to search it out, right? That's really what I feel like we're doing in the context of our work. We're kind of playing this game of hide and seek with God, and he's enjoying it and we're enjoying it, and it's really fun. And so I think this idea that we are, in this state of wonder constantly is really important. But I think the other thing that sometimes we can forget is that God calls us not just to wonder, but to also depend on him. We are intended to live by his word and to walk by his word. And I think sometimes as scientists, we can think so intellectually that we can forget that even in our intellectual pursuits, we need to find ways to depend on God. And so one of the elements of my faith that I think has become really important to where I am is just this dependence on God. I think the more I study, I think it's true for all of us, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And but the Bible says that if we lack wisdom, that we can ask God and he gives it generously to all of us. And I know in my work every day I feel like I lack wisdom and I need to pray to God for instruction on how to run this experiment and what experiment to do and what types of things I should be looking for. When I was a graduate student, I would go around my lab and I would pray over my equipment because I was like, God, I don't know how to make this work. Please make this work for me. And I still do that. And I still pray for I pray for my students as well. And I think that one of the legacies that we're called to leave in our work is not just a trail of new scientific data, but just a legacy of having, students who've encountered us, who we've prayed for. I've often thought, for some of my students, there might not be anyone else in the world who's praying for them, right? And how seriously are we taking that charge to really take care of the people that God has entrusted around us? How seriously are we using our work, which we spend so much time on, as a mechanism for us to learn how to depend on God? The next thing I think we've heard a lot about during this conference is this idea of humility. And one of the verses that comes to mind for me here is that of Philippians 2, verses 3-4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. Here again, this is somewhere where I realize, as a faculty member, I can walk into my office and so easily think, this school is supposed to revolve around me and around my interests. And, you grant proposal person, please get this grant done and help me get it in the way it should be, right? But again, we're interacting with people, and people are so valuable to God. And how often do we take the time to really be humble and to realize that it's not just it's not just about us, and the work that we do, really, God has put us there for a reason. And I think it's really important. I think this verse comes to mind so often for me when I think about dealing with my admin assistant. I am challenged all of the time to make sure that I am acting in a state of humility before her, because she's as valuable to God as I am, as we all are, and the people who are around us. I think it's just really worth remembering that God has placed us there for a purpose, and that purpose is to act differently from those around us. And that often means being humble in ways and at times when it might not often seem common. The last element of faith I want to mention is that of perspective. And I don't quite have a verse for this, but something that really struck me, it was something that God had spoke to me a long time ago that really has, one, helped motivate my work, but two, helped motivate my work, has been the following phrase, which I had taped on my door, and I used to look at it every time I walked out of the house. People are dying. What are you doing about it? And that was a really convicting statement for me. And I work in a field where my goal is to try to seek out and search out new technologies that are intended to help people's lives get better. And so for me, this was so motivating because every time I went to work, I was thinking about how I need to be helping people. Every time I write a grant, I'm so passionate because I know that if this gets funded, it's really going to be able to help someone have a better life and live a better life. But at one point, I realized that even the best of us, and I'm not the best in my field by far, the best that I can do, the best that anyone can do, the best that the Nobel Prize winners in my field can do is extend someone's life for a little while, make life a little bit better. And that was really sobering when I thought about that, because the best I can do is maybe make someone live another year, another 7 years maybe. Is that all that there is? And when I think about what healthcare means, this is the wiki definition, by the way. So healthcare is the maintenance or improvement of health via the diagnosis, treatment, or prevention of disease, illness, injury, and impairments. When I think about that, and I'm in the field of healthcare, or at least trying to make a difference in healthcare, and I think about the things that I'm working on, the cancers of the body, I really had to step back and take a bigger perspective, because I realized, actually, the types of cancers that I work on are not the only types of cancers that we have in the world. In fact, the biggest cancer of this whole world is sin, right? Everyone is suffering, everyone is dying, everyone is in need of better health care. And the Bible tells us that too, right? For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption of Jesus Christ. And so I think about the work that I do, and I think about the best that I can do, but then I think about the best that Christ can do, right? Christ ultimately is the solution for the cancer that is invading this whole world. Jesus said, and it was said earlier, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And Jesus isn't here anymore, but he said that we are the light of the world, that we are a town built on a hill that cannot be hidden. And so I just want to end this time by reminding myself, by reminding all of us, that no matter if we're in science or medicine, or I met someone teaching English, we're actually all in the business of healthcare, because the whole world around us actually is dying. And the only solution that we have that's actually a purposeful and meaningful solution is Jesus Christ. And so we all share a common call. As Christians, we have the capacity to imagine a brighter future for healthcare, because we have the capacity to understand what is on the other side of death, right? This time of no more pain, no more sorrow. That's the bigger experience that really is the model, the ideal outcome for any situation. And we as Christians as well, we're also called to be light. And not only light, we're also called to be God's image bearers, right? He says that in his word. So we're also intended to image a better future for other people in this regard. So people are dying. What are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. That was, it's better the second time. 4 years on, that talk is a vintage talk, and it has, like fine wine, has gotten better over the years as I've listened to it. We want to take some questions now and enter into that. So, Audrey, if you could unmute yours, and you and I will go back and forth together on this. And okay, I see you're unmuted now. You and I on my screen show up side by side. We've got 55 or more in the audience, and the questions have been coming in, and I've taken them down. I'm going to pull some of these together because they obviously are aimed at the details of the talk, and there's some medical questions that are coming in. But several people, as I had mentioned to you before, are really interested in this transition from Stanford to Vanderbilt. They'd like to hear about the rest of your journey. So as I thought about that, you talked about your journey at Stanford as being, to Stanford as being an open door that God had provided me. That must have been when your graduate students and postdocs at Stanford heard that you were now going to go to Vanderbilt. That must have been a wrenching experience in some ways. My major prof at Berkeley announced to us that he was going to interview at Cornell. And we knew how good he was. And all of us spent the next 2 weeks saying, what are we going to do when we don't have a major professor anymore? Do we go with him? All these wonderful things. So maybe you could just tell us a bit about your journey and some of that, and about, if you could just tag on to that, your graduate students' experience. I see that there's some in the audience, and maybe they want to hear this for the first or second time. Okay, so just tell us a bit about that journey, if you would.
Sure. So at this point, I've been at Vanderbilt for, can you hear me, John? Well, okay. So at this point, I've been at Vanderbilt for about 2 years. So I left Stanford maybe 2 years after I gave that other talk. Timing-wise, actually, it was pretty fortuitous and not totally unplanned. I had just kind of had some thoughts of leaving for various reasons. And as a result, I started tapering down my research group before I ultimately left, and so I didn't leave any students in the lurk. Everyone that was in my lab who needed to finish graduated, and I had been reluctant to take on new students towards the end, knowing that I was going to be moving. So I actually moved pretty much with no. I didn't bring anybody with me from Stanford. I started over at Vanderbilt, and so everyone is kind of just had. I think it's been a great experience. In a short period of time, I've rebuilt my group. I have a really great group of people who really work hard and have supported, the work that we're doing. I think in terms of the type of work that we're doing, one of the reasons I moved was to be around other people at the same university who work with light. As you guys can tell, I'm pretty passionate about working with light. And so I'm really fortunate now to be part of a center where all of the faculty and students in that center do some type of medical research related to light. So that's kind of a neat experience and a new community for us to join. And in terms of like the research direction, I've been pursuing some of the same research directions, but also starting some new things. I still work on OCT, although we haven't continued as much with the dermatology work specifically. We have been focusing on the bladder cancer. We have a few other projects that are OCT related. But one of the main things that my lab has really started to do more recently is focus on that last aspect that I didn't touch on in my dermatology talk, which is the low cost. So I'm really focused on developing more technologies that are low cost and that can be more accessible to both people in the US who need it. I mean, the healthcare system is pretty broken and fragmented here. Everyone could benefit from a lower cost healthcare system. So working on new technologies in that domain, including within OCT. I mean, OCT has been a great technology, but it has been, not as easy to distribute because of the cost. So thinking about really how to think about breaking those cost barriers, both with OCT, but also with other technologies that allow us to target other clinical interests as well. So.
Fascinating. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about that recent research, because I saw a paper, and I'm curious about it because it's a kind of fashion-forward sound to the title there in the paper. It's called Wearable Functional Near-Infrared Technology and its Application in Naturalistic Conditions. What is this wearable technology? That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, so I think science is really interested in the brain. The brain's a very fascinating organ, and the way that we study it often is by probing it with different things, usually electricity, but more recently people have been trying to use light to probe the brain to study it non-invasively. The main way to probe the brain has been using MRI machines, but if anyone's had an MRI, it's a big bulky machine in a room, it's loud. Not everyone can handle an MRI. You need to stay perfectly still. So while that technology has been really wonderful to learn a lot about how the brain works and what's going on it's very challenging to do certain types of studies in what are called naturalistic conditions. You know, a big room with an MRI machine is not a natural condition.
Right.
You know, people can't do anything because they're perfectly still. So this is where light-based technologies might have an edge. And so we're working on designs for these light-based technologies that would allow us to do studies in more natural conditions in people's homes or at their workplaces or while they're doing things in general, so we can understand how the brain works and what's going on. Again, like I said before, one of the challenges that my lab has taken up is trying to do this in a very low-cost fashion. So there have been people who worked on these light-based technologies before, but even still, they cost upwards of $10,000 or $20,000 per system. So they're still really relegated to lab environments for the most part. And so we're right now working on systems that are, you know, $100 or less, so that people can buy them for themselves if they want, or, you know, researchers can buy lots of them and do studies with multiple people in homes or other things. So that's the kind of work that we're doing as well.
That's a real disruptive move in terms of medical technology. You move from tens of thousands of dollars down to hundreds of dollars. It's a different scale, and it might change the way we think about medicine in the future. I said to you before, this naturalistic conditions and wearable technology is certainly personal to me. My grandson has had 6 brain surgeries before he was 2 years of age, and he had to be put to sleep every time they did an MRI on him. And that's gut-wrenching for families and for the child. It's so difficult. So we all see that need, and people in their questions are just loving what you're talking about. I have a brother-in-law who has bladder cancer, so I know exactly he's having to have those every 6 months go in and have the wall of the bladder scraped to do a biopsy. And it's very invasive and difficult. When you get to be 83 or 87 years old, that's life-threatening procedure. So fascinating stuff. So people have asked these kind of questions. There's a couple of them here. They want to do a follow-up on those cancers. There were some questions about false positives and what I think those got answered in your talk, pardon me. But in particular, applications. So cervical cancer, pancreatic cancer, are there other kinds of applications of that detection technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think the general idea that we've been pursuing with the studies is that whenever you have cancer, cancer is abnormal. And so it causes changes in appearance, it causes changes in the way light interacts with cancerous cells versus normal cells. And so the technologies that we're using can definitely be applied to multiple types of cancer. Now, different types of cancers react differently. So I think, you know, you can't just take the specifications of the system that we've developed and directly apply them to cervical cancer or pancreatic cancer. But I definitely have colleagues who work in similar fields who are trying to apply them to all of these different cancers. I think one of the neat aspects of my work, so I'm an engineer, but my interest clearly is in applications to healthcare. And so almost all of the projects that we work on, we need a collaborating clinician, both to access the patients, but then also to really give us the right perspective on what are the important problems to pursue and how to make this work in a workflow that can work in the clinical side. I mean, we can have the best technology and then it just doesn't get adopted because, you know, it's not intuitive or it's not the way that, you know, the medical field has decided to do things. There's I can't think of the right word, but there's a kind of well-accepted truth, unfortunately, that even once an idea gets validated as working, being clinically useful, it takes 17 years for it to make it into the clinic as a main technology. There are huge barriers to that what's called implementation science, and there are a lot of people studying that right now. And so I think part of what's neat about the work that we're doing, I mean, we're really interested not just in making these prototypes that sit in the lab, but really making them into technologies that can be used in a hospital. And that requires you to have partners as champions. Right. So, you know, the areas that I'm working in reflect mostly the partnerships that I've been able to establish, but the technologies that we're working on definitely have broader applicability beyond the things that we're doing specifically. And to be honest, I only have so much bandwidth. So I wish I could tackle every problem, but I can't.
Yeah.
My students are probably glad that I don't push them more than they already are working, because they're doing great work.
The Lord did create us limited, but he created so many of us. So there are many more people that we can recruit into this and not feel like we have to shoulder it all ourselves. That's fascinating. Interesting thing about this uptake on technology, because it gets to the social factors. And it's not just a matter of engineering, right? It's also the human side of this and then how this happens. Again, I'm reminded that this is not only a disruptive technology in the sense of changing the patterns of the past, but we're also doing what we're doing today, this marvelous digital technology we have to reach out and communicate and spread ideas and exchange them much more quickly than we've ever been able to do in the past. And I'm reminded that I think I saw the name of a pediatric pancreatic specialist. John Paul is in here somewhere in the list. I saw him earlier. All of a sudden, potential collaborations. I mean, you're talking to people who know and are actually working in the field. And that's a marvelous thing about what the ASA can offer to our colleagues as we have these conversations. We've often thought of ourselves as specialists on ideas and issues. And here, this is less an issue, it's more an application. And it's an outworking of our Christian colleagues. So let's see if we can get another question or two here. I know on the detector, on the skin cancer, there's several people have questions about that. What would a detector look like if you went into a physician's office? What would that thing look like, do you think? Are you close enough to be able to say?
Yeah. I would say one of the advances that has been happening in OCT specifically has been there is a movement towards low-cost OCT, and so there's some work out there already that is, maybe tabletop instrument, and you maybe put your arm under that instrument, and it would be able to see. A lot of the OCT systems have already been handheld for a really long time, so. The idea that you can kind of put your arm up or, have someone hold some piece of equipment and shine it on your back or on your arm. Mm-hmm. That's been around for a long time. The type of work that we're trying to do, is aiming to take it a step further, especially with this low cost, angle to it. And, hopefully we can incorporate some of these technologies that everyone's used to using. I mean, why can't we incorporate OCT into standard consumer products? Why do people have to spend $20,000 to buy a specialized machine? What if they could just, put an attachment on their phone or, put in an attachment on their webcam or something like that and do the same thing? And those are the kinds of things that we're trying to think through and implement. We're not there yet, but we're getting close.
Pushing. Well, then the question was on, you talked about basal cell carcinomas. What about melanomas? Any chance there?
Yeah, so we haven't tried to tackle melanoma, but that is a huge problem. So, basal cell carcinoma is the most prevalent, but melanoma is the most deadly of the skin cancers. And so, that is a big challenge that we personally haven't tackled. I think there are other groups who've tried to do some work with melanoma, with OCT, but then also with other technologies that are not OCT based. Again, everything has a signature in terms of how it responds to light. And so you can use various properties of light to understand what's going on in changes. OCT typically uses scattering, but there are other technologies that use absorption. So, melanoma, skin cancers often have a very characteristic change in color due to melanin. And so those changes in color cause changes in the absorption profile of the light. And so there have been some very effective technologies that developed based more on absorption that can work for melanoma. That's not quite the area that we've been working on, though. So I don't know the latest and greatest of what's out there for that.
Well, thank you for that. That's absolutely fascinating. This notion of light, of thinking about light and detection in a different way is just fascinating, because as you were talking, I was remembering, and this goes to a question that one of the listeners has asked, is that I have sleep apnea, so they wanted to measure oxygen levels in me, at night, overnight. And they put this little clip on my finger, and they shine a light through there, right? And based on the apparently the intensity of the red light coming back, they can tell how much oxygen's in my blood. Absolutely fascinating, non-invasive, and of course the results are kind of remarkable too. But at the end of the day, they told me I was below 85% oxygen concentration at night. They said, if you're in the hospital, we'd have an oxygen mask on you. That was a regular overnight experience. And I go, whoa. So I found that technology fascinating. And now the question from the audience is, what about glucose? We know that glucose detection is so invasive, you have to prick yourself now. Is there a light in that field?
Yeah, that's like almost the holy grail of biophotonics, is trying to do non-invasive glucose detection. And
Right.
there are people who have been working at it. I think the different strategies haven't, there's a challenge because the standard is blood glucose detection. And so, there's a lot of political lobbies out there that don't want to, debunk the standard. So it is a really hard thing to go up against. But there are people who've done various, attempted various strategies to look at glucose. And yes, you can measure some aspects of it, but there are questions about how accurate it is and how sensitive it is compared to the traditional blood glucose monitoring. But people are trying, and trying all different strategies. So, traditional blood glucose monitoring comes from like pricks on a finger, for example. Well, there are people who think that there's signatures for glucose increases in your tear ducts. So there are people who are looking at amount of glucose that's measured in your eye, for example, or they're using different wavelengths than we normally have been using, because glucose as a molecule has absorption peaks in different ranges of the spectrum. So there are some people who are now testing, well, traditional wavelengths don't work so well. What if we went further into the infrared, like, into 1500, 1800, or, 2000 nanometers? These are not visible to the eye, but your body still responds, to these light waves. And so people are trying, but no one's been completely successful.
Okay. Oh, this is fascinating. Well, I'm getting several wonderful talk, Audrey. Congratulations. Thank you so much. People really deeply appreciate what you've had to say with us today. It's just really quite fascinating. In particular, your focus here on your attention to your graduate students. That's a part of an aspect of a career, certainly in academia, where we're direct mentors. I think there are applications in industry, and certainly in government, where younger people are coming in, and those of us who are senior in our roles can listen to what you're saying and transfer that from out of the academy experience into our everyday experience wherever we're working. That notion we need to be caring for other people. I want to turn my attention just briefly and everyone's attention to something that came out in Christianity Today, and it has to do with this notion of mentorship. That in February you were featured as one of 10 women in the sciences, featured in a Christianity Today piece. I think they had that over several weeks, or maybe it was all concentrated in that February issue. But have you had anybody reach out to you because of that, asking you either current mentorship or maybe young girls thinking about the sciences? You're muted. There we
Okay,
go.
sorry about that. Sorry, there's a little background noise here, so I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so I have had kind of one person reach out to me from that article, but not necessarily in a mentorship capacity. It was more just kind of noticing that it existed and just kind of wanting to chat and follow up about it. But yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely something that the faculty at my institution have been thinking a lot about. I've been really blessed to find other Christian faculty, even at Vanderbilt, and we do think a lot about how do we be good mentors to our students, how do we be good professors in the classroom and out of the classroom. And, you know, I think it's a challenge, but it's definitely part of what we feel is our role and responsibility, that to care not just about our work, not just about ourselves, but to care a lot about the people that we're around. Not just our students. I mean, I think I've been challenged more recently by that group to also think about my colleagues, my faculty colleagues as well. You know, and so I think it's been a real inspiration for me to develop stronger relationships with my colleagues on a personal level, just so that I can, you know, I don't want to say mentor them, so to speak, but, you know, just to share their life journey with them and help them walk through, you know, hard things and not hard things.
Right.
I think being a faculty member is definitely a challenge, to kind of walk your faith and also do your work, because especially in academia, you're expected a lot to champion yourself and to really talk about yourself in ways that can sometimes feel like bragging or borderline, you know, being prideful, and
right.
you know, it can be a fine line to walk. So that's definitely something that has been a challenge for me, but I'm really privileged to be able to share that challenge and journey with other faculty as we think about how to best be a light for our students and for our campus.
Well, Audrey, thank you so much for that. You have walked that fine line very carefully so far in your career, and you've been able to communicate that to us today, and we deeply appreciate that. There will be other questions I'm sure that people have. They may actually reach out to you, or they can find you on the Vanderbilt website. You're quite visible there, or through the office. We can connect people as needed. But I want to take this opportunity just to thank you again, and we want to ask the Lord's blessing, as He continued blessing in your career. So I'm going to close this with a word of prayer as we draw this to an end now, and let's just have a brief prayer together. Father, thank you for these moments we've had together. Thank you for the inspiration that Audrey has brought to us. Thank you for your blessing on her life. We pray that you would continue to enrich her experience and give her continuing wisdom, as she says, as we walk these fine lines. And we deeply appreciate what she has shared with us today. And thank you for the American Scientific Affiliation and its outreach, and bless our work, our continued work together as the body of Christ across our country and around the world. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, folks, it's summer something. It's probably warm at your place, and you probably need a little something to top up again. So we have another brown bagger coming up on Thursday morning, or Thursday at noon. Dr. James Shirley. We're going to reprise his talk from last summer at Wheaton. We have a fellows, if you're a fellow of the ASA, there's an event on Wednesday night. And don't forget, we have two different things coming. We have the Friday night State of the ASA address, and we'll take you through some really exciting things that have been happening. And then if you have students that you can think of that have come to mind today, you might mention the Emerging Scholars Mini Conference, which is happening on Saturday. And I'm going to look at Vicki, and she's going to nod yes. There's still lots of room there. We have a good crowd, but we're looking for more, and there are specialty breakout rooms. That's a great event. And we finish our summer something with a worship service on Sunday morning. It's a quintessential ASA event. So if you can join us on Sunday for worship, please do. And Vicki, do you have any closing words for us today?
Sure. Thank you, John, and thank you, Audrey. It feels like just yesterday that we were sitting in the auditorium at Azusa Pacific University hearing your talk, and I loved it then, and it was just as terrific today. And many of you know that the annual meetings are always a highlight for our ASA members. And as I got up today, I realized today was the day that my colleagues and I had flights booked to San Diego for our Point Loma conference. And when COVID became real and we realized that wouldn't be possible, this is the first time in 75 years that we've had to cancel a meeting. We quickly pivoted to our new reality, and our team has thought through in the Summer Something series and thought it would be a great creative way to bring many aspects of the meeting that we all love to you online. And so as John mentioned, this Brown Beggar is the second in our week-long series, and yesterday we had a full house. I see many of you here today that were here yesterday at our prayer and praise session, people from around the globe. And the other part of our new reality is a business model that has been flipped upside down. As you can imagine, and like many other nonprofits, we're in the process of repositioning both our budget and our meetings. And we have some great ideas in place and plans in place for the fall and winter. So stay tuned for that. And we've consciously decided not to monetize these events this week, but we are encouraging and gladly accepting charitable gifts to help offset our costs and support our budget. So if you feel so led to make a donation, you can do so online on our website or mail a check to the ASA office, and we'd be grateful. And I just want to thank many of you who are faithful donors to the ASA and the number of kind gifts that we've received already so far in this unique time. And as John mentioned, we've got a whole week full of exciting events, and they can all be found on the website, and we hope that you'll join us for one or more of them. And certainly feel free to bring a friend, a colleague, a student, a family member, a pastor, because the more the merrier. So thank you again, and hope to see you again this week. God bless.